Vector resolution is when we break up a vector into what are called horizontal and vertical components. So to resolve a vector simply means to break up that particular vector, break it up into two components or two parts. These parts are the x component and the y component. The x component is also called the horizontal component, and then the y component is also called the vertical component. So vectors can be broken up into two parts, a vertical part and a horizontal part. Right, I have a number of vectors here. This vector number 1, the horizontal vector, okay, it does not have any vertical component to it. So for this particular vector here, it only has the horizontal component. So no vertical component for vector number 1. And then vector number 2 here is just acting vertically like this. So this particular vector here, it only has the vertical component. Okay, it does not have any horizontal component to it. So a vector which is horizontal only has horizontal component and no vertical component. A vector which is vertical only has the vertical component and no horizontal component. However, if our vector is acting at an angle like this one here, vector number 3, this particular vector here will have two components. If I have a vector which is acting at an angle, I have to resolve it. I have to break it up into two parts. So starting from this tail here, I can draw a horizontal component. So it has to line up with the head of the vector here. So this particular vector from the tail up to this particular point here in our horizontal dimension, we'll call it the Rx. The Rx is the horizontal component or the x component of my vector here. Suppose my vector is called R, right? So this is Rx. If my vector was called F, this will be called Fx, right? So, but this is the x component for my vector. From here, starting from the tail here, I can draw a vertical force, but it has to line up with the head of this particular vector here. So maybe up to somewhere there. This particular component now we'll call it the Ry, which is the vertical component of my force. So this particular force or this particular vector has two parts. We call this horizontal component and the vertical component. Okay, and this is the angle here that the force is making with the horizontal. Now we need to be able to calculate these components here. Now the way we calculate the components, we say Rx is equal to R cos theta. Theta is the angle here between the force and the horizontal. And to find Ry, we simply say Ry is equal to R sine theta. Right. So this is how we resolve. Once you do this, you'll have resolved a vector. So vector resolution is breaking up a force or a vector into two components, the x component and the y component. Right, here's an example here. In example 1, we are being asked to resolve the following vector into its vertical and horizontal components. So I have a 50 Newton force which is acting at an angle of 25 to the horizontal. So I must resolve it into vertical and horizontal components. So I'm just going to illustrate on my vector here. So the horizontal component will start from this particular point, okay, and it's going to point to the right. So this one here would be called Fx. So this is my Fx here. So it must line up with the head here. And then from this particular point, I'll draw a vertical component. So up to this particular point here, I have my Fy. Right, so I have Fx and Fy. How do I find my Fx? I'll simply say fx is equal to f cos theta. So I have 50 newtons cos the angle, which is 25 degrees. So I take out my calculator and I do the math. So I'll say 50 cos 25, that's 45.32 newtons. And this particular component is pointing to the right, right? So I can say to the right. Remember, these are vectors that you're dealing with. You have to give the direction. All right. So that's my fx. And how do I find fy? I'll say fy is equal to f sine theta, which is equal to 50 sine 25, which is equal to, take my calculator, just replace that with the sine. 50 sine 25, I get 21.13. So that's 21.13 newtons upwards. The two components of my vector here. So doing this is called vector resolution, breaking up a vector into two parts, the horizontal part and the vertical part. So every vector which is acting at an angle here has two parts to it. Right, here is example number 2 here. In this particular example, I'm given a 60 Newton force, which is pulling a 5 kg block. 2.1 says determine the vertical component of the 60 Newton force. So this particular force has two components, right? So let me resolve it. So I have a horizontal component to my force here. I'll call this one Fx. And then from here, I have a vertical component to my force. I'll call it Fy. So the question says calculate the vertical component. So the vertical component is the Fy component here. So I'll simply say Fy is equal to F sine theta, which is equal to 60 sine 10 degrees, which is equal to 60 sine 10. I get 10.42 newtons, and this is upwards, right? Next up, determine the horizontal component of the 60 Newton force. The Fx component is what they want here. So I'll simply say Fx is equal to F cos theta, which is equal to 60 cos 10 degrees, which is equal to, right? Let's calculate 60 cos 10. I get 59.09. So that's 59.09 newtons. And this is to the left. Alright, so this is how we simply resolve vectors into its components.